Good evening, everyone. My name is Sam Nasser, and this is the Cleveland C# VB.NET user group. A little bit about the group. We meet once a month. Meetings are free of charge and open to the public, and we cover any and all topics related to .NET. You can find meeting information over on meetup.com with the link listed below on the slide. I would like to give a big thank you to our sponsors. Once we get back to meeting in person, Tech Systems has been supporting the space that's available for us. Also, we would like to thank Inedo for the pizza and drinks they've provided in the past, as well as in the future. And likewise, a big thank you to PostSharp and DevExpress for sponsoring the prizes that will be given away using the evaluation form. And I'd also like to say thank you to NIS Technologies for sponsoring the web hosting. We have a special offer from Manning.com. If you use the promo code or the discount code MTPCLEC21! You have a 35% discount on a selection of books, and the link is available on the slide there, and that will also be made available in the chat window in a little bit. Some general information, please keep in mind participation is always encouraged. The only stupid question is the one not asked, so feel free to jump in either by chat or verbally to comment or ask questions. However, when not speaking, kindly ask you to mute your microphone just to avoid any background noise. And we always like to keep it casual but organized so the presenter can keep progressing with the demos and the code, but questions are always entertained at any point in time. Lastly, presentation is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube. So if you're not comfortable with the camera, feel free to go out. And so for tonight's feature presentation, Joe Guadagno, and he will be talking about debugging tips and tricks with Visual Studio. Joe's the Director of Engineering at Rocket Mortgage. He's been writing software for over 20 years. And although he works for Rocket Mortgage, he's based in Phoenix, Arizona. And he's been a Microsoft MVP for 10 plus years, an international tech speaker, and he's been very active in the .NET community, talking about a variety of topics related to .NET, Azure, and the like. Joe loves to spend time with his family, play games, and is into home automation, much like myself. And you can read his blog at josephguadagno.net. And so with that, I will turn it over to Joe.
Thanks for the introduction. I kind of have to update my bio a little bit. I think it's a little bit more than 20 years, and some of the bio is a little bit different. You know, he loves to hang out with friends and family. Thanks to COVID, I think I'm kind of sick of my family at this point and ready to hang out with new people. Enough with the joke around. My name is Joe Guadagno, like mentioned. I am a director of technology at Rocket Mortgage, which Sam already mentioned. You can reach out to me on many different ways. At Twitter, at @jguadagno, where I blog and post a lot of content around .NET, Azure, personal stuff, including other products, not Microsoft, like JetBrains Rider and things like that. You can follow me on Facebook at josephguadagno.net, LinkedIn at Joseph Guadagno, or jjg.me/aboutjjg. It's a shortcut to my blog where you'll find lots of content related to everything technology, so to speak. And then I stream 3 days a week. Typically, I haven't probably done it in like 6 months now because it's just been crazy. But enough about me. You're not here to hear about me. Let's go through the agenda. So we're going to start off with just doing lots of debugging. We're going to walk through apps and pretty much no more slides. So that's the end of the slideshow. I'll bring it back up for content information. So now everyone should be seeing my screen. Hopefully the font size is good for most people. See a show of hands or in the chat if you can see the font size well enough, or should I increase it?
I should also mention there's a toolbar on the side that everyone should be able to see that allow you to increase the font.
Oh, the toolbar allows you to increase the fonts? I can see the toolbar.
Oh, sorry, not the font, but rather zoom in on the presenter screen.
Okay, cool. So this is a relatively basic application. It has a person class that has a couple of properties: first name, middle initial, last name, email address, date of birth, children. and one helper method that will display the full name. We're going to just loop through this application in many different ways just to kind of show the content. So we're going to kind of loop through and print out stuff and populate things. But before we go and do that, let's introduce you to a couple of different things with it. I'm going to try my hardest to talk about the physical keyboard shortcuts I'm doing, if I do any. Because I'm using Visual Studio 2022, I don't have the normal presenter shortcut that I have, which kind of displays the keyboard shortcut. But in all honesty, the keyboard shortcuts I use could be very different from the keyboard shortcuts that you use. I am using what is called the Visual Studio C# shortcuts, and you can tell that by going to Options, and then under Keyboard, you can choose. So I have Visual Studio C# 2005, and there are multiple ones to choose from depending on your choice. So your keyboard shortcuts will vary. I will show you where all these items are on the menu or toolbars as I use them. So first, you'll notice that there's a couple of menus up here. We're going to really focus on these two here, the build and debug, and then we'll talk to some of the toolbar items in a minute. So if you go through the build, you'll notice a couple of different things. Now this menu is going to change dramatically. The same thing with the debug once we're actually executing our application. So we have the first, which is build solution. That's going to go through the entire solution and compile it and build it. Essentially take your source code, in my case C# program, and convert it into a console app or .NET exe in this particular case. Rebuild solution does the same thing. It kind of just goes out and builds anything that's fresh. Clean solution will go out and delete all the previous builds for the project and allow you to start from scratch. We're going to skip over the code analysis because that really depends on the version of Visual Studio. And then you have the build, rebuild, and clean, which are specific to the project. So the first set of menus is for the solution. That's everything in the entire .NET solution. And then you have the individuals for a project. We're going to skip pack and publish because those are more for if you're building a NuGet package or publishing your source. Batch build we can cover, but not a lot of people use it in great detail. And then there's the configuration manager. So we're going to take a look at the configuration manager for a minute. So out of the box, you typically have two solution configurations when you do file new project. There's something called a debug configuration and a release configuration. So if I hover down on the list, you'll see debug and release. And these solution configurations allow you to do a couple of different things. Each one has its own configuration, which allows you to configure environment data for it, how you deploy it, what you deploy, whether or not you want to write out to a log file or not log out to a log file. But there's two key differences between the debug and the release. The debug configuration writes out what's called a PDB file, which we'll see that in a second, whereas the release file doesn't, or the release one doesn't. You can also see these by going through this menu here, which says debug. Now, because my font size is a lot bigger for presenting, this is not realistic. Normally this says debug, and if I switch to release, you'll see the whole thing in release. The code flashed. I don't know if you saw that over the screen share or not. It flashed because it kind of hides things based on whether or not it's debug or release. So the first thing we're going to do is just clean this solution. So I'm going to do that. You'll notice in the bottom in my output window, it says 1 succeeded, 0 failed, and 0 skipped. Well, it should only be 1 because I only have one project in here. So let's do a build solution. Now, in a couple of seconds, depending on how quick your machine is or how complex the project is, it's going to do a couple different things. The first thing it's going to do is restore any NuGet packages, which you see here, and then it builds it behind the scenes. If I chose build order here, I would see a lot more data. For the most part, you don't need to worry about that. So let's see what the differences are between the build and the release. So we're going to go through and I'm going to right click on my package, and depending on whether or not using Visual Studio or JetBrains Rider or potentially on a Windows machine or a Mac machine. I'm on a Windows machine right now, so it's going to say open folder in File Explorer. If I was on a Mac, it would say reveal folder in Finder. So I'm going to open that up for a second, and then hopefully you can see this. This is a copy of that directory. So you see here my main mastering debugging.csproj file, and then I have my person.cs file and program.cs. You also notice I have two other directories, a bin directory and an obj directory. If I open up the obj directory, I'll find a whole bunch of stuff here. NuGet cache, some JSON files, some info files, a couple of props files and target files. These are what's used by a holdback from the C++ days of the object linker. This is actually what creates executables on the Windows platform. It's going to combine them into these individual OBJ files and ultimately into the exe. For most people, you don't really need to know that, but it's kind of good to have an idea. The bin file is where all your code is going to go, or not your code, your compiled assets, as well as any assets you include, like your configuration file or maybe images and stuff. And you notice in my case, there are two files, a debug file and a release file. These correspond to the solution configurations that are defined here because I have two of them defined, two of them appear here. In a normal scenario or a more common scenario in my environment, I have 5 different configurations. I have debug, I have development, I have test, I have UAT, and production. Because all those typically get deployed to different areas, all those have different configuration files, so they have separate folders, separate builds, and separate pipelines for them. So if we open up the debug folder, you'll find a couple of different things. Here's the main executable that we created. This is the exe.config, which Visual Studio took from my app config and renamed it to your exe name.exe.config, which is the standard. And then there's these 4 other files, which I didn't create, and I have no idea how they got there. Well, actually, I do have an idea how they got there, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So the mastering debugging.pdb, PDB stands for Portable Database, I believe. This is actually a database or a data store of your source code. So if you ever wrote an app and you get a message that said object not set to an instance of a reference, and then it says in line in line 5 of C:\project/whatever, and you had a whole bunch of those lines. It knows that because it builds up a database of your source code and links it to where that thing is executed in your application. So when you are deploying a release, you never want to deploy this file. And in most release builds, if configured correctly, this file doesn't get generated. So if you develop ASP.NET apps, you'll see, if you ever get that yellow screen of death or the white screen of death now, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in it, it comes out from this PDB file. The vshost.exe is actually something that Visual Studio generates, and it's a kind of sort of copy of your application, but this is what actually runs when you're debugging your app in Visual Studio. Visual Studio attaches, quote unquote, to this file. And we'll see a little bit about that in a second. And if I go down, you'll see a .NET 6 directory. Because I built in .NET 6, there's a whole bunch of deployables for that. So let's take a look at the ways we can debug the app. So there's a couple of different ways. The most common way that most people do is click on this little green play button here, and that starts the debugging. If you hit the drop down, you'll get a couple of different options. Now these options depend on the type of solution you want. I don't want to deploy to my WSL instance right now. If you're doing a web app, you'll get options in here like deploy to IIS or run with the internal Kestrel worker project, etc. You'll also notice that there's a hollowed out green button. This is start without debugging. So let's talk about what the two do. If you click on this button, it's going to start the application and just execute. I won't have the ability to get into the code at all. I can see here, it ran the application, no breakpoints or anything in there, and I get that everything was successful. If I click the play, I have the ability to get into here and debug the application. So there are a couple of different ways you could do that. Like I mentioned, you can hit the play button in there or the play start without debugging. You can also do that by pressing F5 or Control F5. We're going to skip over the performance profiles because they vary depending on the version of Visual Studio you have. We're going to come back to the windows in a second. The attach to process is another thing that you can do. So if I go here and click attach to process, you're going to get blinded right now because my screen was all dark and now it's white. You're going to get the ability to attach to any given process. So for those of you that don't know, everything that runs on a Windows machine is called a process. Every executable is a process that runs on a Mac machine or a Linux-based machine. They're all called daemons. They're things that just run in here. So what this thing does is it's going to show you all the available processes. So if I expand this a little bit, you'll see that there's something on my machine that's running called application frame host. There's something called code insiders because I'm running Visual Studio Code Insiders on that monitor because I have my show notes and things I want to cover listed there. And apparently it's running 17,000 processes on my machine. You'll notice I'm running Docker. I'm running something called conhost and then a bunch of other things. And I'm always scared about running this because I never know what's going to show up on here. But this allows me to go and to attach to a process. So if I wanted to, and I was bold enough, I can say, I want to see what's happening in Visual Studio Code.insiders. I could double click right here and automatically attach to it. That doesn't mean I would get the same debugging experience I would get, with a .NET application. It just depends on whether or not you have the source code with it. Couple of new features to Visual Studio 2022, which is what I'm running right now. There's this show processes tree. So this one handles it a little bit different. So you can see from code-insiders, it has a couple of different side processes that are running, including this Microsoft SQL Server Tools service, which is running that instance of conhost exe. Docker Desktop is running a couple things. So you can see that there are quite a few things running. 99% of the time, you don't need to do this because you're only debugging your application. But there are some times you might want to do this. So I kind of skipped this a little bit on top on purpose. This allows you to connect to a process running on another machine. So let's say it's Friday afternoon and your boss's administrative assistant or executive assistant is running this report that you ran, and she executes it and it's not working. You go to her desk and play around a little bit for his desk, and you can't figure out what's wrong. Back in the day, you'd sit there and say, hold on a second, I'm gonna go grab my floppy disk or my disk drive and install Visual Studio, wait 20 minutes or an hour for it to install and debug it. You don't really have to do that anymore. Assuming you're on the same network, you can go and find her or his machine in here. Like right now, it's telling me connect to Dell 5540 because that's the name of the machine I'm currently working on. I can hit find and get the discoverability, but once I do that, I will get a list of all the apps, and then I could debug the code as if Visual Studio is running on that machine. And by the way, if there are any questions that pop up, feel free to mention them in the chat. I'm kind of keeping an eye on the chat window. I don't know if there's a raise your hand feature or not, but just type in the chat and I'll get to them. This is a relatively fluent demo, so I can just change things up as needed. So let's go and cancel out of this and then look into the rest of the windows. Do you have to build any specific way to do that remote debugging? No. The only caveat to it is the machine has to be on the same network, meaning it has to be accessible, and I believe a certain port has to be open, but the port is like a default port that is open on every machine, and you should be able to do that. You don't have to do any special builds, no special installs. As long as that exe, as long as it's an exe that you have on your machine or the source code, you can do it. Let's see, other debug targets, we won't do that. We're gonna talk about these little things in a second. Let's go look at the windows. Notice we have 4 or 5 windows, which we're gonna talk to in a second. So let's get to the first step of debugging. So there's a couple of different ways you can start. The first typical step in debugging is hitting what's called a breakpoint. A breakpoint happens by definition, it puts a break in your code once your code reaches that point. Sounds silly to use a definition. There's a couple of different ways that you can do it. If you click on the line, you can come over to this gutter. You'll see there's a gray circle. If I zoom in a little bit on it, you see this little gray circle. I can click on it and it now turns red. Now what that did was put a breakpoint. Now my code turns red. Your color may vary depending on your configuration, but by default, it's typically red. So now if I start the code, Visual Studio is going to run the code up until this point, and then it's going to stop. So this is the console app. Everything was built. If I look at that console app, which is here behind the scenes, nothing has been displayed because no lines of code have executed. You'll also notice that my toolbar at the bottom turned bright red, which tells me I hit a breakpoint. The current line here turned yellow to tell me, excuse me, that I am at this line. Now, from here, I can do lots of different things. So I'm going to open up the bottom a little bit, and we're going to see a couple of other things. So the first thing that shows up is the locals window. And there are 5 key windows to the debugging experience: the local window, the watch window, the call stack, the exception settings, and the immediate window. And we're going to walk through all of them, in the next 30 minutes or so. You can also get to those from the debug window. But you notice now that he opened up the debug window, it expanded. It's probably twice the size now. So there's a continue button that I can press or hit F5 to continue the application. There's a stop debugging, which says, okay, I'm gonna not debug this app anymore, pretty much quit it. So stop the app where it is. It won't execute any other lines past line 10 because it stopped on line 11. Detach all says, okay, continue running the app, but remove Visual Studio from it. So if you remember before, I talked about how Visual Studio started this vshost.exe, and then it attaches that. It says pretty much Visual Studio sits here and says, I'm going to watch everything you're doing. This detach all says, I don't need to do that anymore. You keep running. Terminate all just does that. It stops any and all processes that are related to this application. Restart the app will restart the app from beginning. In this case, pretty much end it and restart it. Apply code changes is a new feature in Visual Studio 2022. It works with certain areas, certain technologies, and I don't remember which ones because it's changed like 3 times before the build, but essentially allows you to dynamically apply your code changes in a lot of different scenarios without having to stop and restart the application. The others, again, we're just going to skip because there's not important for this. Then we got a couple of other steps that we're going to go through, and we're going to cover those in a minute. And then the toggle breakpoint, which is another way. Before I clicked into the menu, I can also type F9 or press F9 to enable and disable that breakpoint. I can manually create a new breakpoint, which is a lot harder to do. Then I can delete all breakpoints or disable all breakpoints. We'll cover the other stuff in a little bit. If I go through Windows, you'll notice there's a heck of a lot more windows. Before there were only 4, now there's about 30. These windows vary depending on where you are in your application and what type of application it is. The first up to this line, so whatever that is, 15 windows are available for every application. The Live Visual Tree, Live Property Viewer, XAML Live Preview, and XAML Deep Binding Failures are for WPF apps, web apps, and other user interface apps. Call stacks, threads, modules, these 3 are always available. Call stacks we're going to walk to. Threads and modules we're not. They're if you're doing parallel or asynchronous development, and I don't want to show that here. IntelliTrace events are only available if you're using the Enterprise Edition of Visual Studio. They're not available for Professional, so I tend to not cover it. And then the rest are there. These are typically used if you're using C# or C++ or assembly. As you can see, I just clicked on the registers and I can see the actual program registers, which is great if you understand assembly, which I don't. Okay, so what can we do with the breakpoints now that we have them? I can do a couple different things. So I'm going to focus on this toolbar right up here. So if I zoom in on it, you'll see there are a couple. So now, in addition to the debug, I now have a continue button. I have the hot reload. I have the find in files. These were there, but now I have this new toolbar that popped up, which is debugging. So that's everything from this point to this point. So this is the pause or break all. This is only valid when the application is running. So if like you're running through a long for loop, you can hit that and it will stop. This will break the app altogether. This restarts the app. We have this one which says show next statement. It's disabled right now because I'm already on the next statement. We got step into, step over, and step out, which I'm going to cover in 30 seconds. We have step backwards, which we can do. It's just going to take us to submain and step forwards. And then the last button is show threads. So let's take a look at the stepping forward. So if I go here, I have the option to step into or step over. So the difference of the two, right now, this list people method for this line 11 is going to call a populate people. If you scroll down, we'll see an instance of the populate people here. Essentially, it's going to create a new list with 4 people in it: myself, my wife, my son, and my daughter. So if I want to go into this code to see how it's working, I can choose step into. So I click step into, and you notice now my line moves to here. So I'm going to do one more step into, and now the next line that's being executed is this return new list. You also notice I get this little flashy arrow here. This is the light bulb. Ooh. Sorry about that. I disabled the phone, but it's still ringing. This flashing light bulb comes up and gives you a couple suggestions. Right now, it's telling me to change this into an expression body, but that's not important. Once I realize what this code is, I can say, okay, I'm good. I can continue executing. So I can hit the step out button, and that's going to pretty much execute everything left in this populate people and come up to line 11. So now I was able to step into it and then say, okay, step out of it. So I'm going to restart this app because I'm going to show you the next feature, which is the step over. So now we're back in this line and I want to step over it. So now if I click step over, which is F10, it's going to execute that code and populate the people. But you're probably wondering, how did it populate the people, Joe? Well, there's a couple of different things you can do to see that. So we're going to go back to some of our windows here and look at our locals window and watch window. So if we look at our locals window, we'll see that there is something called, and I probably have to zoom out a little bit, but mastering program populate people returned a count of 4. So the populate people method returned a count of 4, and I can see that there are 4 entities in here. If I look, I see myself, Joseph, number 1 is my wife, and so on and so forth. So I can use this local windows and see that the argument I created for people, because people is a variable here, has a count of 4. Now, the local windows shows you what's in scope based on where the code is. So you notice it doesn't have a reference to something called person. If we look at line 13 here, I have a person referenced here. It's not available here because that is not in scope yet. Once I get to the next line, if I do step over again and run that, now I still have the people, I have parent count, but everything else went away. So let's go and do 2 more step overs, I think. Now I have a person that's available, and the person is null right now, right here, because it hasn't finished. It's at the line that's ready to assign that person, but it's not there yet. So I'm going to do 1 more step over. Now the person gets populated. Now it's a value of mastering debugging dot person. If I highlight it or expand it, you'll see you'll see the details of it. So it's me, Joseph Guadagno, last name J, my date of birth, etc. Which is all cool. Most people probably know that. Let's go through a couple other things that we may not know. So I'm going to click stop, and I'm going to get rid of this breakpoint for now, and I'm going to put a new breakpoint here. But let's say for some reason I know my application is broken when we get to my daughter. Now, my daughter in this list is pretty small. She's the last person on the list. So it's only 4 people. I can hit F5, 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 F5 if I wanted to until I get to her. But there's also another way to do it. I can put what's called a conditional breakpoint. So as I hover over here, you'll notice that there is a little settings button. So I'm going to click on the settings button for a second, and it pops up these different conditions. So we see here that we have C program or program.cs line 15, character 17 must match source. That just says that the source has to be here for me to run it. I can do something called a condition that says when this happens, execute this code. So here I say conditional expression is true, and I put in C# syntax for what's true. So I'm going to do person dot, and you see I have full IntelliSense, first name equals Emily, which is my daughter's name, and it will only stop when that condition is met. You'll also know over here, or notice over here, that I have now a plus button or a plus icon in my breakpoint, which tells me that there's a condition on it. And if I hover over it now, it tells me that the conditional expression person.firstname equals Emily has to be true for this to break. I also have actions. So when this condition is met, I can do something. I can, output to the console at my daughter. And I should probably never do that because I can never spell daughter right. And then in Visual Studio 2022, they introduced this new feature called remove breakpoint once hit. So what this will do is get rid of that breakpoint the first time it's hit. You'll also notice that here, this changed because I added an action to it. So now my little dialog is now a diamond with the plus in it, and the line changed to yellow. So let's go and run through this. If I got the conditions right, the output of the text will stop at Emily. So I'll only have myself, my wife, and my son. Let's go and do this. Pull up that console app. Should pop up on screen in a second. Unless it already did and I missed it. I think it already did and I got it wrong. Because that is the app. Yep. I got something wrong. So let's go and take a look at what the condition is. Oops. Let's add a new breakpoint. Let's set the condition. Person dot first name equal. Oh, I think I did a single equals probably. I hate when I do that. Let's do it one more time. There it goes. So it stopped at the breakpoint of here because we were getting to Emily. So now it knows that this is where I want it to be. And I could go and open this up and see that, oh, here it is, it's Emily. And the reason why there's a problem, she has a middle initially, whatever. But we were able to get to that point without me going through and without me having to go through 4 other records. Now you can imagine if you were looping through a record set of 1,000 records, but it only fails at number 513, that you'd be doing that forever. So this is a very handy feature to go through. Let's take a look at the next thing on here. We're going to go and take a look at the another thing with the breakpoint window. Let's open up what's called the breakpoint window. So let's go to Debug, Windows, and Breakpoints. Now from the breakpoint window, you can see a list of all the breakpoints in any condition. So I'm just going to add another breakpoint here and another one here. And you see they get added to this window. And I can also do a new data point on function. Now you have to be really good at this. So like before I type in program.cs, line 17 character 13, and hope I got that right. Ooh, and it added it, but I don't think that's actually going to work because it didn't highlight it. Oh, it didn't highlight on 17. But in either case, you can get those. You can also temporary delete one. Like, let's say I really don't want this one right now. I can click on it here and disable it. So now it's disabled. The breakpoint is still there, but it's not going to execute. I can also re-enable it or disable it from here. This is all well and good. You know, there's lots of different ways to do it. But now it's Friday. You haven't figured out that problem on your executive assistant's computer, and you have to go. You're on vacation, and you gotta tap out to your good old friend Sam to help out. You got pretty far in it, but you didn't get all the way there. You have a couple of breakpoints. You got a scenario set up, but how do you get that to Sam? Well, it's a good thing you asked. You can now, or actually you've been able to for a while, export all the breakpoints. So I can do, where is it? I think you have to right click here. You can do export selected, and then it will generate an XML file that you can then re-import to show all those breakpoints. You can save this into, you know, your source repository if you want for those, or, you know, just pass it along. You can also add labels to it. So here I'm going to add a label and call it Emily the problem child, and click add. And now that label is there, so I can tell them, look at the Emily is the problem child label, and then Sam can go, you know, figure it out where it is from there. So I'm going to remove all, actually, I'm not going to remove all the breakpoints. We're going to do one more thing with breakpoints. So this code for parent count is kind of cool, but actually let's do that. So we have the breakpoint with Emily. I want to get to just here where we do the breakpoint of this. So there's a couple of different things you can do. I can go and say, hey, I want to get to the press enter, or you can kind of force your way there. So let's say you're in debugging, which I am right now, and I'm here. We broke at the point where Emily is the problem, but I want to get past that. I don't really care about that problem. You notice, I didn't click abort, but thank you. You'll notice a very faint play button here. So if I zoom in, you can probably see it. Run execution to this point. So I can now click to here, and it's going to run the execution. But all that did was run to the last breakpoint. And since I have a breakpoint above, that's going to cause a problem. The better way of doing it now, I'm going to stop and restart it. The better way of doing it is you can hold the shift key now once I'm over here. So I have this code, I'm at this line. Hey, where'd my little shift guy go? Sorry, must be pressed something here. Once I press my shift key, this becomes a double play button. So fast forward for those of you who had a VCR back in the day. 1 second, I'll get to your question in a second, Sam. If I click this, it's going to skip those breakpoints and jump automatically to that line. But there's yet another thing you can do. Let's say I had all these breakpoints in here. Well, let's actually just disable them for now. So I'm going to go to debug, and where is it? There's a disable all breakpoints for now, just to get rid of them. You'll notice here that I have a shiny yellow arrow. that's telling me where the code is. I can actually take that and move it anywhere. Like I can move it to here. When you do that, though, it does not execute anything that moved forward. It won't execute the parent count. It won't execute this write lines. It won't execute this press enter when done. So if we look at the code, it didn't write out the last person. It didn't write out the number of parents. So that allows you to skip chunks of code as you're moving. You can also go backwards and replay. Let's say I wanted to reload that list. I can execute back here, and I'm going to just do step over, and my person list was repopulated with 4 people. Keep in mind when and if you ever do this that it re-executes that code. So if that populate people was a insert into the database, it would have reinserted all those records again. It's going to execute whatever code it is. Then you can also do that by right-clicking and choose run to cursor or shift force run to cursor. So this is that little green forward button icon I hit. This is the shift forward button icon. The set next statement will take it and run that as the next statement. That's the comparable of me just dragging and dropping. The run to here will run until you get to that point. Now to Sam, your question, aside from label, can you add additional notes to breakpoints? Technically, no, but there is another thing that I'm going to show in a second that allows you to add notes to your debugging. So if you notice here, when we're starting to look at this person, so let's just continue this run, and we're going to get to Emily. Oh, I think I hit restart on accident. Or what did I do? I don't know what I did, so let's restart it. We're going to run it, it actually ran because I disabled all the breakpoints. So let's restart it. Now we're going to get to Emily. Now you notice a lot I have console.fullPerson. If I hover over it, I hover over this, I get this data tooltip. So here it says that person.fullname, and then there's a view equals Emily. Let's say I want to see that. I can now take that view and I can pin it. So right over here, there is a little pin button. I can hit that pin button and now that stays there. So no matter how often I run it, so I'm going to go and do, I'm going to run the code to back here. So let's do set next statement here and then rerun it. So you notice Emily, that text became grayed out because Emily's not in focus anymore. That line of code's not in focus. So I'm going to shift F10. I can hit refresh here and it's not going to do anything, but this is the last known value for it. And as I shift through this, I'm going to do Control F10. Everything just turned red. It turned red because the data changed. So the person.fullname property changed and the actual property value changed to Joseph J. Guadagno. If I run through it, it's going to go gray again because it's out of scope. I run it again, hit person, and now it changed to Deirdre. You also notice, or might have noticed if I had this open, that the values changing here. So I hit F10, and as I do this, once I get past the next one, now the person object is gone. I click person again, and I expand it. As soon as I hit F10, everything changed. Everything went red, except for the last name, because our last name is the same. That's kind of cool. To your point, Sam, can I add notes? You can add comments by expanding these data tips and saying, This, seems to be the problem. And then that comment is saved. Then you're wondering, well, how do I go and share this with Sam now? Because I've already shared the breakpoints with them. How do I share the tooltips? Well, you can do it the same way. If we go to debug, there is a export tooltips and an import tooltips. You can clear all them or clear just the ones that are pinned. So if I choose export, it's going to give me the ability to save them to an XML file. You might also notice that there are a little wrench here, which just tells you that it's a property name. But then there's also this view button. Now, if I drop down here, you'll see different visualizers. By default, it's going to try to be smart enough to pick the right visualizer. So here, because this is a string, it's going to use text and it's just going to display text. If it was XML, like reading from a reader, or the string had XML in it, you can choose the XML visualizer and it will give you straight HTML. The same thing with JSON or HTML. So if you're just pulling in a string that's special, you can do it. There's also other third-party visualizers for like visualizing data sets and visualizing images, so you can see them straight from here. But the data tooltips do a lot more than just this. So I'm going to go and delete all the breakpoints so we can see, that we have the images. Or actually, let's just delete all the breakpoints for now. Yes. Now with this here, I can go and I can hide the comments, I can unpin it, or I can close it. I can also kind of drag and drop this anywhere. So I can put it off to the side and I can add another one. If I hover down on the person and expand it, I can say, let me see the person's first name. So I'm going to do that. I always want to see the person's first name. So now I have person's first name and their full name. So let me go and I'll just keep that there since I'm having trouble grabbing it. Oh, there it goes. So I can see their name and I can see their full name. But it doesn't stop there. You can actually change these values. So no one calls me Joseph unless I'm in trouble. So I'm going to go and double click on my name and type in Joe. Now, as soon as I hit enter, watch over here and watch over here. I'm going to hit enter. Person.full name changed. Now, because the full name is a property that concatenates first name, middle initial, and last name, it went and changed. So Visual Studio is like, hey, this property changed. Here it is. Here it's red here. It changed red over here because I changed it. Now, keep in mind, this only changes the in-memory copy of the data. If this is in a database, it doesn't go back and update my name to Joe. Further on down the line, if there's something that saves this person object to a database, it will go and do that. But this is only a short-term solution to allow you to test something out. So let's see, maybe that's not what's breaking. Maybe it's breaking because the middle initial was wrong. So if I want to do that, I can double click here and remove that and see if that's working. So it keeps everything up to date as you're doing it, which is a kind of a cool feature, if you ask me. So that's data tips. You can also make those changes straight from the locals window like I did here. No one calls him Joe because this is actually my son. They all call him JJ, and his middle initial is J. Oops. I got an error because I forgot to enclose it in quotes. So that's cool. But let's say you don't want all that clutter right there on the screen for you. You want a little bit better way to present that data. You can do something called a watch window. So right now there's nothing in the watch window. Let's say I want to watch the person's full name. So I can right click on the full name property, and then I'll get a whole bunch of stuff here like the start, rename, but there's these other variables here that add to watch and quick watch. So I choose add to watch. This is now here. It's telling me the name doesn't exist in the current context because it wasn't loaded when I ran it. So I'm going to kind of restart this app. And when we get, oops, I need a breakpoint here. It's probably too late for a breakpoint. You'll notice here it says value from the last debug session. So we knew last time I was here, I was at JJ, Guadagno, and JJ for last name. And I have to restart the app because I forgot the breakpoint again. Oh, I know why. I can't add full name because it's a computed property, but I can add, I can look at the person object and add, let's add the first name to it. And then I could add others just by typing them. Last name. It's really weird when it says it doesn't have it, but it actually, oh, because I didn't complete it. Last name. You can get the same viewing here that you want. So you can actually save these, and these are saved as part of your project, your user file. So you can use them throughout. And this actually should be person dot full name. So let me delete this watch point and do person dot full name. Ah, come on. Pretty bad. Person dot fu. Person dot full name. And then it'll show that. Yes. Thank you, Robert, for your private message. I didn't realize I forgot the person part to it. The powers of live demos. But thanks for the private note to cover me. Let's see, what else did I forget? There was one more thing I forgot here. Oh, I forgot this little window on the side for diagnostic tools. And sorry, I'm bringing it out a little bit because that's where my GoToMeeting is. So you notice there's a couple of things like show events and exceptions, and there's no exceptions here right now. But let's generate a fake exception just to see what happens when Visual Studio sees a fake exception. So I'm going to do when children.childCount children.count equals 1 or greater than 1. Let's just do that. p.childCount equals greater than 1. Now this this might fail. I don't remember if this was the line that failed. Got that breakpoint. I'm just going to run to cursor because we learned that one. Let's do force run to cursor. And then hit function F10. And we get an exception thrown. Now the exception got thrown because there is an object not set to an inference of a variable, because some of the children in this, some of the people in this list don't have any children. My son and daughter don't have a child, so this one throws. So we end up getting this exception dialog box. Now this exception dialog box does a couple of different things. Basically tells you the most infamous .NET message ever created, object reference not set to an instance of an object. If you've never gotten this message in your software development, kudos to you. You either just started yesterday or you are an expert, because this one comes up all the time. So you can do a couple of different things from this dialog box. You can say break when this exception is thrown. So I turn this off saying, no, I know it's a known problem. I don't want to worry about fixing it. Or I can say only break when it's thrown from this DLL. So I don't care about it anywhere else, just in this DLL. You can also do open exception settings. And this brings up a dialog box right here, which tells the IDE what exceptions you care about that you want to break. So if you see the solid circle or the solid square, that means it's always going to break on those. If you see actually no, if it's checked, it's always going to break. If it's white like this, it's only going to break on some of them. And if it's totally black like this, it's not going to break on any of them. 99% of the time, you're good with everything that Microsoft suggests. But like I said, in this case, I might not want to see this. So I am going to turn that off, and it's never, ever, ever going to break on this. You can do edit conditions also, which says only if it's in mastering debugging .program do I want to break. Then you see now in 2022, they added this play button to do it. So I am going to fix this and change this back to the right way where it says does not equal null, or if I want, I can use pattern matching now and do not null, or is not null, sorry. And now it says when it's there. So I can actually run this code right now, do the hot reload. And yes, I know it doesn't matter. And then hit continue and the bug goes away. Any questions before I get on to the next little piece? That was just cue for I needed another drink because my throat is getting dry. Two more windows to cover, and then a secret tip that most people don't know about when they're debugging. Next window we're going to talk about is our immediate window. Oh, well, before we go to that, you see we now have an exception. We actually, while we were running this app, we generated an exception. If I click on this, I can see actually where in the code that exception happened, which is kind of cool. The immediate window. I don't really like the name of this window because it's kind of deceiving. It's not necessarily immediate, but it kind of is. I think what the premise is that you get to immediately see the result. So from the immediate window, you can execute most C# or VB or F# code right here in the compiler. There's a couple limitations, like some lambdas you can't do and some delegates you can't do. But let's say I wanted to check the date of birth for this person. So I can do person dot date of birth. And it prints out the date of birth. Because the date of birth is a date time object, it printed out everything. Let's say I wanted to kind of check the formatting of it. I wanted to play around and, I want to pretty print this date of birth. So I'm going to do person, lowercase person dot date of birth, and then toString, and then pick the formatting of that string I want. Luckily now with IntelliSense, you have the ability to kind of look at that, but I have the ability to see which one I want. Do I want sortable? Yeah, that looks almost right. Or do I want general for date and time? Oops, general. Yeah, that's the one I want. Even though I'm in US and it's not a pretty thing, that's the one I want. Then I can come up here and update my code. So the immediate window allows you to execute stuff. It has the same rules that the editing does of editing any data tip. It doesn't go back and update any databases. It changes the copy of the memory. That also means you can re-execute code. So let's say I do a force run to here. I can re-execute and recall setting the people. So I can set the people. Let's say I did person dot or people dot remove at and then 2. So it said expression has been evaluated and has no value because it's a void. So now if I do people count, it should be 2 if my math is correct, or maybe 1. It's 3. So it eliminated Emily again. So I don't want that, so let me refix that. So I'm going to do people equals populate people. And now I have the count of 4. So that's cool. One of the other windows to show is the call stack. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here just to get us into the call stack window. So let's restart the application again. And now I'm here. So if I go to call stack, it shows me everywhere that's been running. So right now I'm on line 25 of the populate people method, and it was called from line 11. If you look now, line 11 has this gray area because that's what called it. Line 25 through 30, because it's one big line, is highlighted in yellow. Now I can click on here and Visual Studio will take me right to the line, and then I can see what line has been executed with it. I can also, modify this breakpoint and add a new condition to it that says only enable this breakpoint when another breakpoint is hit, and I can specify which other breakpoint. So I can only hit it if it's called from this breakpoint or this breakpoint was ever hit. That allows you to have more than one breakpoint on there in the event that you want to keep more than one and not have all of them execute. So one last little tidbit I will give, and then I'll turn it over to any questions, is a thing called debugger display. So you notice here when we execute the program, and I'm just going to put a breakpoint here. When we execute the program and we look in any of the windows, forgot that. Let's hit continue. Wherever a person is called or people, if we look at the locals window, it always displays this mastering debugging. Now, if we look at it, it's a mastering debugging dot person. And then I have to open it and kind of look at the code to see which one it is. By the way, you can also pin in here, which will put that to the top. So by default, it orders it in property name. If you want to order it differently, you can pin property values and they show. So now when you hover over a person, so if I go to my next breakpoint and hover over a person, it now says first name equals Joseph and last name equals Guadagno. But there's an even better way you can do that, or a slightly different way. This loses its context after Visual Studio restarts. There's another thing you can do called the debugger display attribute. So right now in my class, I'm going to unhide this region. I know some people think regions are bad. For demo purposes, this is perfect because I don't want people seeing it. So if I uncomment out this, I now have this debugger display attribute that I can write anything I want. So it uses the string interpolation to write this out. So this says, hey, debugger, anytime you want to display this class, display the full name property with the comma, date of birth, time, and then date of birth dot minute. So I have access to any of the properties. So because data time is a struct, I can usually do period and get IntelliSense with it. Number of children, and then children count. Now, you know, children count in our previous example caused some problems. the debugger display attribute makes sure that that doesn't happen. So it'll just put certain text there, which we'll see in a minute. So now if I hit play, and I gotta remember to remove that breakpoint. Now if I hit play and I hover over the people, or I can just look at it here, now it says Joseph J. Guadagno, date of birth, time was 17, number of children, should say 2. Oh, I must have lost a child, but in theory, this should say 2. And then here, you'll notice I get the object reference not set to an instance of an object. So I know that I can't display it, but it's also showing it's not breaking my application, which is cool. There are a couple of other things you can do in the debugger display. Let's say this date of time was a social security number or some other PII, personal identifiable information that you don't want to show. You can do a debugger browsable and set the state of it. So here I'm saying that you can't browse that date of birth. Now there's a couple of different options for it. There's a collapse, which meaning it's hidden, but you can show it. Never means you never ever see it. And root hidden says don't display for the root element, but as you go down into a collection to display it. So I'm going to choose never. Now if I run it and go to the people, you'll see here now the date of birth is now gone, but I still have access to the date of birth. I can do people dot, or people, let's just do 0 dot date of birth, and it executes. It's just not browsable. It's not shown as a default property. And I believe that was everything, right? I didn't miss anything. Cover the output. Not going to cover. One last window to show you is the autos. Autos is very similar to local, except Visual Studio tries to determine what properties you want to show. That being said, that is all for the demo. I'll keep Visual Studio up in case anyone has any questions, but I will turn it over to the audience for any questions that there may be. And there were no questions, it seems like. So Sam, this is where you come on and say, great job, Joe, blah, blah, blah. Let's go to the drawings. Is there any way to make that private? To make what private, David?
Hold on, I wanted to make sure I got my question in before you finished. So for the example you had where we had social security number.
Yep.
You tried to disable, say, a developer is trying to connect to production. They had a bad week and they're trying to, mess up some stuff. Is there a way that we could disable that from, say, the intermediate window, or any other ways that we could try and maybe prevent that sort of access to, say, sensitive data?
If they have access to the running code, there's no way to turn that off. There's no way to hide that value from them. You can hide it from browsable, but you can't say this property is not accessible via anything outside of the code.
Okay, thank you.
That would be an awesome feature, though. I don't know how the debugger would handle it, though.
Any other questions for Joe? All right, so this is where I come in and I say, great job, Joe. No, seriously, thank you very much. You've brought a lot of insight, a lot of tools and tips and tricks on debugging apps. So very insightful. And thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, if you do have any other add-ons, like ReSharper adds a couple of other features. There is also another great tool called Ozcode. I'm not being paid by them or anything, but it's something I generally use for added debugging that has some of the replay, some of the better starring and abilities that you've seen here. But this is usually more than enough for 90% of the people.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so just wanted to share some end of meeting announcements and resources. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And in the chat window, you have a variety of different links pertaining to some of the items that I'm going to cover here. As far as the recording for tonight, that's going to be posted on YouTube, and it should be uploaded within a couple days after the editing process. You can subscribe to the channel. That way you'll get immediate notifications once a video is uploaded. The tech events, which are relatively brief this month, they're going to be posted on my blog. Excuse me. And then the feedback evaluation, there's also a link for that in the chat window. In addition to the special offer from Manning, where we get 35% off, and I provided the link as well as the discount code in the chat window. As far as events, it's pretty slim pickings this month because of the holidays, but one meeting that's going to be happening for sure is this meeting in December. And because we usually run in the fourth week, we're going to be coming up against Christmas. So we decided to move the meeting over to the 21st, which is a Tuesday. And we're going to have Carl Franklin on next month. And he's going to be talking about .NET 6 and some of the new features in Blazor in .NET 6. As far as conferences, although not virtual, this one is in person. CodeMash, January 11th through the 14th. And tickets are available on sale. And to get those tickets, go over to codemash.org. A thing that we always like to do at the end of every meeting, discuss job openings. Tech Systems always has jobs available. You can find them over at techsystems.com/itjobs. But more importantly, who's hiring right now and who's looking for work? Feel free to jump in verbally or through chat and make your need be known. Anyone hiring?
Tech Elevator's looking for instructors, if anyone is interested.
Excellent. Tech Elevator, the Cleveland branch, I take it?
This is national live remote, so you could do it remote, as well as most campuses, Cleveland, Columbus, Pittsburgh, if you're in that general area.
Gotcha. Very good. And for C# or Java or both?
Both.
Okay. Very good. Thanks, David. And as Joe had mentioned, Rocket Mortgage is always hiring. The job openings that you're looking for, Joe, are they junior, senior, mid?
Everything. Everything. Junior, senior, mid, interns, database administrators, you name it. We probably have an opening for it.
Okay, good to know. Would you happen to know the URL?
rocketmortgagecareers.com.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Okay, if you do come across something or your place of employment is looking to hire, feel free to send me a message and I will send it to the group. And with that, my contact information, if needed, you can reach me at snasser@nistechnologies.com. You can also find me on Twitter and my blog, samnasser.blogspot.com. And lastly, I invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. And so with that, thank you all for attending. Thanks again to Joe for joining us and presenting. And hope you all have a great Thanksgiving and look forward to seeing you in December. Good night, everyone.
Bye.